This is 1 year later, the series on this YouTube channel where we take a look at prospects drafted in the most recent draft and talk about their progress between then and now. In the first episode, we're talking about Moritz Seider, a guy that the Detroit Red Wings fans absolutely love. But it wasn't always like this. A year ago, Moritz Seider was in a different territory than he is now, and in fact, nobody really thought of him all too much compared to nowadays. So, in this video, we're going to be taking a look at how Moritz Seider went from pretty much a big reach of a draft pick to one of the most beloved players in the Red Wings organization, and one of the players whose NHL potential seems to be unmatched within the organization. Now, a year ago, Moritz Seider was getting prepared for the 2019 NHL Entry Draft. If we go over to his Elite Prospects page, we can see that the majority of the consensus for Seider was in the teens of the draft. ISS Hockey had him at 17, Future Considerations at 16. HockeyProspect.com had him at number 10, which was the highest one over here. McKean's Hockey had him at 15, and TSN and Bob McKenzie had Seider at 16. NHL Central Scouting had Seider at 6th overall for European skaters, but that's only European skaters, so if you include the North American guys, that averages out to about 12 to 17, in that range as well. So Seider was mostly perceived to be a guy to go in the teens, but you could see the surprise on my face, on everybody's faces, and on Seider's face himself when the Detroit Red Wings selected this big 6'4" right-handed German defenseman 6th overall in the 2019 draft. Now, at the time, I recall talking about this earlier in a video too, Red Wings fans were kind of confused. Some of them were like, okay, but Dylan Cousins was available. Okay, but Podkolzin was available. Okay, but Caulfield was available. Okay, but all these other highly touted players were available. Even on the back end, Philip Broberg is a guy that a lot of people were expecting to go somewhat high as well. But Seider was the guy who ultimately went 6th. I saw many people who criticized the pick, saying that players who had higher potential were indeed available, and Seider is kind of shooting a little bit lower here. But, in my opinion, immediately after the draft pick, I made a video saying that I was honestly kind of surprised, but I understood it. Because Seider, to me, a year ago, was a guy who didn't really explore his hockey playing ability to the best of his extent in the DEL with Adler Mannheim. Last year, Seider was at a pretty interesting number. He had only 6 points in 29 games, but the fact of the matter is Seider was in a position where, playing for a pro men's league, he wasn't trained to be an offensive dynamo. The way they played Seider was more of in a training wheels-like role. They wanted him to focus purely on the defensive side of his game. Which is why when you watched Adler Mannheim in 2018-19, you would see Seider not really get involved in the play offensively at all. He'd stand still at the blue line while his other teammates did their thing, and then he'd backcheck and charge defensively that way. But a year later, after a year with the Grand Rapids Griffins and a year of being overwhelmingly loved by Detroit Red Wings fans, Seider has shown to us all why the Red Wings wanted to take him 6th overall, why they didn't trade down, why they chose Seider over a guy like Dylan Cousins or a guy like Zegras or a guy like Podkolzin. Seider this year had 22 points in 49 AHL games played. That in itself is a pretty nice number for an 18-year-old right-handed 6'4" defenseman. And in fact, it's indicative of how Seider was actually deployed a little bit differently with Grand Rapids. They use Seider on the power play. They use Seider in more offensive situations, and they allowed him to play his game a little bit more. However, that wasn't at the compensation of the defense. Because if you watch Seider in Grand Rapids this year, many Grand Rapids fans will tell you that probably the biggest strength that Seider has out there on the ice is his overall poise, defensive awareness, and safety. Because when Moritz Seider has the puck, it's extraordinarily difficult to take him off of it. If you try to go in for a body check, he'll see that, he'll adjust his body, and he'll make it impossible for you to actually get the puck away. When Seider has the puck, he's aware of everything that goes on the ice, and he's able to almost always flawlessly make the safe play in getting the puck out. He was never supposed to be a highly touted offensive defenseman. Seider to me was always a really good two-way guy who could move the play forward and really do a great job compressing it in his own zone. It's why the majority of his points this year were actually secondary assists, because he would send the puck up to a guy, and then the guy would find another guy, and then they would score. When you watch Moritz Seider play the game, you look at him and you say, that guy's not 18. No way that guy is 18. Because the way he plays is so calm, it's collected, and it's so mature that there's a reason he was able to find himself in a solidified top 2, top 4 role in the AHL immediately upon being drafted. Here's a quote from Steve Yzerman talking about how Moritz Seider was playing this season. They're really pleased with his development, he says. At the start of the season, I thought he would average 17 minutes, 18 minutes a night. I looked at the ice time recently, and he's been at 25, even 27 minutes a game. An 18-year-old D-man in that league? It's tough. He's playing in all situations, and he's touching the puck. We watched him play a lot last year on the men's team in Adler-Mannheim, and he didn't get a lot of power play time. Here in Grand Rapids, he's getting on there and he's handling the puck, and you see his play along the blue line and the offensive part of his game coming, and being able to log those big minutes is great experience for him. Now, AHL ice time deployment isn't actually a stat that's available anywhere online, but if Steve Yzerman is saying himself, yeah, the guy's getting 25 to 27 minutes a night, then that is a very, very impressive sign. How an 18-year-old can play half of a game, pretty much, and still find ways to improve and become better. It's not really about points when you talk about Seider's game and what he brings. Moreover, it's all about how he makes your team better. And that's what he does when he gets out there. He also has this edge where he's not afraid to hit anybody on the puck. Because he's 6'4", 207 pounds, he's a freight train out there when he goes and he wants to hit somebody. Sure, the decision-making on when he hits could be questioned a little bit, but at the same time, he almost never sacrifices his defensive positioning to get a hit out there. A year ago, Seider was one of the guys who I thought had untapped potential because of how strong he was able to play the puck and how efficiently he was able to play in his own zone. But a year later, after marinating in the DEL for all of his draft year, not being allowed to play offensively, and coming over to Grand Rapids and being given that offensive key, we're seeing another side of his game that has potentially been untapped over the past 2 years, pretty much. Seider also captained Team Germany at the World Juniors this past season. He had 6 points in 7 games played. He was a very, very strong defenseman, and earlier on, he actually did lead the tournament in scoring for D-men. But even though his offensive production did dwindle down as the tournament went on, his strong play in his own zone and his calming presence out there in the blue line never waned in the slightest. Going forward into the future, Seider has the potential to become a legitimate minute-logging defenseman, a guy who could play top 2 minutes and not get tired and not show any wear whatsoever. I don't see him getting upwards of 40 points, but when you draft Seider and you play Seider, you're not playing him to get 40 points. You're not playing him to be an offensive point producer. You're playing him because of the safety he brings to your back end, your own zone, your team as a whole, and how positively he's able to affect the game around him. That's why Seider was drafted 6th overall, and a year ago, people wouldn't have guessed it in the slightest. So, that concludes the first episode of 1 year later. I hope you enjoyed this video. So that Troll 99, and bye.